There's not much the left-wing Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and hardline conservative US Vice President J.D. Vance agree with each other on, but in March 2025, there was something. Amongst an inflammatory conference in Berlin with many of the biggest European powers present, Vance went into attack mode. European leaders were outraged by his speech, which felt belittling towards Europe. But one person was listening more to what Vance said rather than how he said it, especially in regard to the perceived threat of mass migration into Europe. It was Mette Frederiksen, and she wholeheartedly agreed. Frederiksen had, by that point, championed some of the harshest immigration and asylum policies in all of Europe. She had openly called for Denmark to have a zero refugee policy and said on mass migration, and we'll quote her here, "I consider this mass migration into Europe as a threat to the daily life in Europe." And this leaves us with a few questions. What path did Denmark take to get here? How did a socialist prime minister adopt far-right immigration policy? And how has the country got on since making these radical changes? Just a quick disclaimer before we start the video, really. I know we started already, but anyway. Immigration, refugees, and asylum, it's a sensitive topic across Europe at the moment. We're not here to try and sway your opinion one way or the other or tell you what to think. We're going to try and give you the facts and analysis as it exists. No one's perfect, but solutions to such large issues start with objectivity and fair debate, which is what we're trying to do here. So, we'll start with the big picture. Today, in 2025, migration is a top priority across Europe. Politicians are trying to tackle a continent-sized problem on a country-by-country basis. And in the stereotypically egalitarian society of Denmark, this has proven a major policy shift since the mid-2010s. It is made even more strange by the fact that this change came not from the hard right, but in more recent years, from the centre-left. But let's go back and see how we got here. Immigration began to grow in Denmark post-World War II, but mostly and rapidly in the last several decades. Since 1985, the Migration Policy Institute shows that the proportion of Danish residents who are immigrants or who have two immigrant parents has increased more than fivefold. Now, that is an inherently, potentially misleading statistic, and there are a lot of those when it comes to immigration. So it's important to understand the numbers involved here in general and in relation to both European and non-European immigration in Denmark, as when people refer to immigration within Europe today, it is usually in relation to non-European immigrants. Denmark's population is a shade under 6 million people, so let's use that big, round number to count with. According to the Danish government website Statistics Denmark, 16.3% of the population are immigrants or descended from immigrants. That equates to about 978,000 people. And that seems like a lot, especially in comparison to the 3.3% in 1985, back when Denmark's population was about 5.1 million. Denmark also publishes data for where these people originate from. In total, 462,309 non-European immigrants and their descendants are in the country as of Q2 2025, making up around 7.7% of the population. There are about 45,000 asylum seekers in total, which is 0.75% of the population. That doesn't include Ukrainians, who have their own special status in Danish law. So in terms of the total number and proportion of non-EU migrants, there has undoubtedly been an increase since the 80s. But it's also important to remember that around half of the immigrants that end up in Denmark are European, and large numbers look scarier when you don't have all the context. But already, by the 90s, you had far-right parties in Denmark who noticed their communities start to change, like the Danish People's Party, who championed anti-immigration nationalist policies. One member of the party interviewed by the BBC stated, quote, "We don't see ourselves as racists, but we do feel we are losing our country." Slogans like Danes First only resonated with a few at first. But by 2015, the migration crisis into Europe was growing, mainly owing to the war in Syria, causing millions of Syrians to be displaced across Europe, often arriving via Turkey or the Mediterranean. Suddenly, the concept of egalitarianism for refugees in Denmark wasn't just some humanitarian ideal, it was a reality on their doorstep. Sweden and Germany took more refugees than anybody else in Western Europe, and Denmark is geographically close to both. As refugees started to arrive in Denmark also, but in lower numbers, those same slogans whispered quietly from years ago were suddenly resonating with the electorate on a major level. Local mayors and authorities outside Copenhagen started telling the government about the attitudes of the people on the ground amid a speedy influx of migrants to more affordable communities outside of big cities. Denmark's famous welfare system was soon perceived to be under strain. Infant schools were said to be full of children who didn't speak Danish. Some unemployed migrants reportedly received resettlement payments that made their welfare benefits larger than those of unemployed Danes, and the government statistics suggested immigrants were committing more crimes than others. Local resentment was growing, which fueled political parties and attitudes like that of the Danish People's Party. By 2015, it was the second largest power in Denmark's parliament. Other political parties saw the writing on the wall. Attitudes were changing. Migration was becoming a cornerstone campaign issue. There was an opportunity for a party to come down hard on immigration, which would likely lead to electoral success. And nobody took that opportunity like the to that point left-wing Social Democrat Party, led by their new leader, Mette Frederiksen. The party had a previous reputation of openness to migration, but in 2015, Frederiksen, recognizing growing public resentment towards immigration, switched tact. Under her leadership, the party tacked towards what's generally seen as the political far right in terms of migration and made hardline DPP-associated asylum policies their own. They won the election on this platform in 2019, and they've gone even further in the years since, building on the already highly restrictive immigration policies that had started to come in the years prior. On the changing attitudes that prompted this change, Frederiksen stated, quote, "My party should have listened." Since the Social Democrats have gone from strength to strength with this new stance, whether out of cynical recognition of the attitudes of the Danish public towards immigration to win votes or a recognition of the future scale of the European mass migration crisis, Frederiksen and her party were decisive, and it has paid off for them. They are well ahead in the polls to win the 2026 election. So, that's the why. But what are the policies? Why are they considered some of the most restrictive in Europe when it comes to immigration? And how does the EU fit into all of this? Okay, before we dive into what laws Denmark has been passing lately, it's important to recognize Copenhagen's unique position, which has allowed it to legislate in the first place. And that's a story that starts in 1973. In 1973, Denmark voted via a public referendum to join the EEC, the European Economic Community, which the greater EU eventually evolved around. Skip ahead a few decades, it is 1992, in Maastricht in the Netherlands. The EU is in the process of being founded from the EC, the European Community, which previously evolved from the aforementioned EEC. This is being done by the signing of a treaty. Some countries choose to have a referendum on whether to join the wider EU organization, and Denmark was one of them. It will join the EU, but only if a public referendum doesn't reject it. Spoiler alert, it does, with 50.7% of the vote. This was quite a sophisticated political maneuver for an entire adult population to make, but it actually gave the Danes all the power. You see, the Maastricht Treaty could only come into effect if all 12 of the EU states voted to ratify it. No Denmark, no EU, no single market. Brussels had to compromise, which led to the Edinburgh Agreement in December of that same year, allowing Denmark 4 opt-outs on things they didn't agree with. 1. The euro. Danish currency is called the krone. To be fair, there are plenty of EU countries that still have their own currency and don't plan to join the euro, like the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Sweden. The difference is that all those others are technically required to start using the euro at some point, while the Danes have a permanent opt-out. 2. Defence. It would not participate in EU defence policy, at least until 2022, when they scrapped this requirement in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 3. Citizenship, but not in the way you might think. In a more symbolic carve-out, Denmark used a lot of legal jargon to establish a hierarchy of citizenry. In short, it was just to tell the population through law that they were Danish first and European second. The Danes still are EU citizens and enjoy all of the benefits of it, like freedom of movement, but for Copenhagen, it felt like an important distinction worth making. And finally, 4. Denmark opted out of overarching EU legislation which mandated certain rules in policing, civil law, and crucially for our story today, immigration. So, Denmark was free to make its own choices on immigration and didn't have to adhere to things like the EU Common Asylum Policy. It allowed them to pass all the legislation that you're about to hear about. Again, not necessarily totally unique to Denmark. Poland and the Czech Republic are the same. Denmark's carve-out status here just means the Danes can't do it without pissing off Brussels. Okay, so the policies that the Danish Parliament have introduced are plentiful, and they can be broken down into 2 groups when discussing immigration in Denmark. Practical policies, e.g. doing things, and perception policies, e.g. saying things. First things first, practical policies. And there are a lot of them. Following the mass migration to Europe in the mid-2010s, Copenhagen was spooked by what their local authorities were telling them, so it started to draw up plans to crack down on uncontrolled migration and asylum claims in the country. According to the BBC, the government had first looked at detaining migrants without papers on a Danish island that used to house a centre for contagious animals, but this plan was eventually rejected. Then in 2021, a piece of legislation was passed into Danish law, allowing asylum claims to be processed and refugees to be resettled to third-party countries they make an agreement with, like Rwanda. You may recall the British government attempting to recently do the same. However, the Danish plan has gotten about as far as the British one, so currently people who do migrate to Denmark are able to stay when they enter, at least for now. When refugees do come by land or sea, armed guards along the country's fortified border are permitted to confiscate any and all personal items of value, over €1,300, on their way in, stating that this money from these items then funds the costs associated with asylum procedures and housing. In reality, confiscations are rare, and Danish officials tend to act with a bit of discretion. Remember, Danes pay the highest tax rates in Europe across all household types. They expect top-notch public services in return. Current PM, Mette Frederiksen, argues that migration levels threaten social cohesion and social welfare, an issue that will affect the poorest Danes the most, so monetary policy is strictly enforced. Under her and the previous administration, social welfare and benefit payments for asylum seekers were lowered by almost 50%, and if asylum was rejected, all payments would stop completely. They would still receive food, but no money whatsoever. When feasible and practical, they are then deported, or more recently, moved into prison-like detention facilities. According to a 2025 Info Migrants report, people are also offered a flat fee of up to 5,400 Danish kroner, a little over €700, to go home and use the money to set up new lives, no questions asked. Reports from the BBC suggest it used to be as high as 20,000 kroner, or just under €2,700. There are also steep fines for face coverings, which means religious headwear that masks the face, such as the Islamic burqa, is effectively banned. And the Danish government have since sent aid to foreign countries where they experience migration from to improve the situation on the ground there, hopefully stabilizing them and further reducing overall migration from those nations. But this was not a purely humanitarian measure. Social Democrat MEP Christel Schaldemose stated that climate change would contribute to further mass migration if not brought under control, and we'll quote here, "Climate change, of course, will move many people around the world. We need to ensure they have something to live off in their own countries." However, the Danish government go far further in practical policies unrelated to money. For example, there are tightened rules on family reunions, where it is not as easy to go through the legal process to bring a family into the country just because of an individual's refugee status. And if they do manage to get in, they do not have the indefinite right to remain, like in some other countries. Refugee status in Denmark lasts for 2 years and has to be extended for 2 years at a time as long as the nation they are fleeing from is still deemed too dangerous to return to. If your extension is rejected, you will likely get deported. Or if the Danish government decides your country's safe again. Amnesty International reported on 3 separate occasions in 2019, 2021 and 2023 that Copenhagen has revoked residency permits for Syrian refugees, causing sizable protests. Because Denmark isn't beholden to EU standards on immigration, it has the authority to decide when a country is and isn't safe to return to. And at those times, they deemed it was. Meanwhile, once you get refugee status in the country, Denmark has a whole other host of hardline policies to drive integration. The Parallel Societies Law is one such example, which allows the state to sell off or demolish apartment blocks in troubled areas where at least half of residents have a non-Western background. In 2018, the so-called anti-ghetto law was passed, which generally aimed to reduce the number of non-Western residents, a term enshrined in Danish law, in certain housing areas to less than 30% by 2030. These laws were expanded on in 2021 when the government granted local authorities powers to set up prevention areas where they can refuse to rent to anyone not originating from the EU or EEA or Switzerland. That includes the UK. And finally, children born to immigrants are forced to assimilate into Danish society through a mandated 25-hour per week of separation from their parents, starting at age 1. Parents who refuse can have their welfare cut. And gaining citizenship is almost impossible for many people. Applicants for citizenship have to stay in the country for the entire duration of the application process, which can take up to 2 years to complete. Never mind that they also have to be residing in the nation for 9 years before you can even apply, or 8 years if you're a refugee. There are a fair number of other exemptions as well. When the application process ends and you're going to pass, you have to physically attend a ceremony and shake hands with the mayor or another government official before you can officially be considered Danish. Denmark's immigration minister, Kjær Dybvad Bek, said of the ceremony, quote, "Not everyone can or should have Danish citizenship. It is a big deal to get one, and when it happens, it means that you want to live in Denmark until you shake hands at the ceremony. You must live in Denmark. This is common sense." This was actually controversial when it was passed in 2018, as some applicants did not always want to shake hands with someone of the opposite sex owing to their religious beliefs. Any candidate must also sign a declaration of allegiance to Denmark, be able to support themselves financially, and have worked full-time for 3.5 of the past 4 years. And on top of all of that, candidates have to pass separate language and citizenship tests which ensure that those wishing to apply deeply understand the country and are functionally fluent in Danish, an extremely difficult language to learn. On top of that, the fee to apply for citizenship in 2023 is 4,000 Danish kroner, about 530 euros. Nearly half of candidates have their applications rejected, ensuring a pretty consistent flow of free money into the government's coffers every year. But we're still not done. Remember the perception policies we mentioned earlier? Well, the Danish government have a vested interest in keeping overall immigration and asylum claims low, so they intentionally create a, quote, hostile environment for migrants, according to Alberto Horst Neidhardt, a senior analyst at the European Policy Centre. Denmark is keen to have that message spread, and here we are spreading it to you, so by even talking about it, we're kind of doing what Copenhagen wants. Indeed, in 2018, then Immigration Minister Inger Støjberg stated in a social media post, quote, "They are unwanted in Denmark, and they must feel that." Denmark has put advertisements in Lebanese newspapers at the height of the migrant crisis, for example, warning how tough Danish migration policies were to further deter people from trying and to reduce the incentive for people to want to go to Denmark in the first place. Overall, the nation has adopted a zero asylum goal, effectively meaning it would like to have its number of asylum applications at zero, with everyone either integrated or rejected. The immigration minister put it plainly, stating that no more people should come to Denmark than their society can handle. So, we hope we've given you a square look at the pretty hardline policies Copenhagen has taken on without any fluff or opinions. And now it's time to ask the hard questions. What are the impacts of these policies, both good and bad, and is it working? Again here, we're going to try and keep this objective. We're not going to sway one way or the other, it's not our place. So, we're going to give you the facts, the arguments, and counter-arguments, and you can make up your mind where you stand for yourself. No media can be totally unbiased, but we are trying. Today, Denmark has become one of the loudest voices suggesting that migrants should be processed outside of the continent, and it is leading the charge as a pioneer of restrictive migration policies. Many countries in Europe have somewhat restricted immigration policies, but unbound by the EU's rulings on it, Denmark is able to go much further than these other countries might, making it a leading voice in this ongoing European debate. Both in terms of asylum seekers and economic migrants looking for work, there aren't many places on Earth harder to stay in. In 2024, it granted asylum to just 864 people. Not the lowest in Europe, Hungary approved just 29, but 864 people is scarcely a medium-sized village. For reference, the UK, which is considered to have something of an immigration debate going on right now, had 64,000 people granted asylum in that same year. Even if you scale that up for Denmark to account for the respective populations of both countries, the UK would still be granting asylum to 6 times more people. And in early June, Frederiksen teamed up with 8 other European leaders to call for a reinterpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights, whose tight constraints, they claim, prevent them from expelling foreign nationals with criminal records. She is remarkably in touch with understanding the sentiments across Europe from many, stating, quote, "The message that our populations in almost all European countries have tried to send to politicians through the years is please get in control of our borders and be decisive on migration." Some see Frederiksen's shift to the right as a cynical ploy to get into power and stay there, regardless of how sincere it was. It was certainly effective as a political strategy. In the 2024 European Parliament election, the populist and nationalist Danish People's Party barely held a single seat. Their power, once growing, is now non-existent, leaving the ruling party with very few actual rivals. Frederiksen has shored up her government's position significantly, and she herself is getting a lot of plaudits, even being potentially earmarked for the presidency position on the European Council someday. When the Social Democrats went down this route, it did cause a schism, leading to a number of resignations within the party, but it has also paid off massively even despite that. However, if the winds of change do roll through again at some time in the near future, the Social Democrats might struggle to stay in power. Many policies, like the so-called anti-ghetto laws, are considered discriminatory by some, but others talk about its sheer effectiveness when it comes to lowering crime and increasing integration into the Danish population, although the crime statistics are disputed. The Danish government states their statistics show non-European immigration is linked to higher levels of crime, whilst humanitarian organizations like Amnesty International state there is no correlation between the two. No matter which way you slice it, the low numbers show Copenhagen is getting results. And the Danish people, for the most part, they're happy about that. In a 2024 opinion poll, 46% of Danes think that no more or only a few Muslims should be allowed to emigrate to Denmark. So, a large proportion of the populace want these kinds of changes. The government of the day is listening to its people, having seen the issues that the rest of Europe is tackling with regards to mass migration. But these policies undoubtedly have downsides, and it's up to regular Danes to make up their minds on whether the trade-offs are worth it. For example, legitimate Danish citizens with migrant backgrounds, either through their parents or naturalization, have been made to feel like outsiders in their own country. According to the BBC, it's a deeply politicized thing. According to the ODI's country study on Danish attitudes towards migration, almost half of the Danish population feel immigration makes the country a better place. However, many are motivated by the concept of migrant crime and feel like keeping immigration low is a national security issue, although it is worth noting that crime statistics in Denmark from non-Western migrants are perceived as far higher than their actual level. Similarly, there's outcry from the international community. Nadia Hardman, a researcher with Human Rights Watch, stated the following on Denmark's rightward slide, quote, "It is another demonstration of Denmark sinking to the bottom of its refugee rights responsibilities." Some state that these changes have seriously damaged Denmark's perception as a country that upholds human rights for refugees. Meanwhile, human rights organizations like Amnesty International are concerned that policies like bulldozing ghettos will lead to homelessness and insecure housing. The Committee for the Prevention of Torture, or CPT, said that upon examining the immigration detention centres in Denmark, that it had encountered inhuman living conditions in some of them. And an advisor to the EU's top court described the non-Western provision of the Parallel Societies Law as discriminatory on the basis of ethnic origin. So these laws, they're not without their critics from wider Danish and European society. Denmark, for its part, is prioritising its focus, the Danish people, and their well-being first. Copenhagen also claims that their laws are humanitarian in nature because they prevent people attempting the dangerous journey across the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe. They also undermine the efforts of traffickers who exploit the desperate, and they invest in the nations where migrants come from. It's not all stick. There is carrot as well. The Syrian returns policy is arguably the one that has seen the most controversy. Despite Copenhagen's insistence that the country was safe enough to return to, Amnesty International reports that detentions, disappearances, and torture of returnees continues, while sectarian violence in the country is still present generally. In other cases, certain policies have been questioned for their efficacy or consistency of approach. The payout policy for asylum seekers, for example, may be exploitable, but no data for whether this occurs currently exists. Similarly, some have questioned Denmark's stance on Ukrainian refugees who were given an exemption to many of these rules since the war began. Of course, Ukrainians stand firmly in the Western category, and the whole situation there is much closer geographically, so perhaps Copenhagen feels more obligated to help their fellow Europeans. But in real terms, activists might argue that there is no difference between war over there and war over here. Should Ukrainians' plight matter more to Denmark than, say, the Sudanese, for example? There's no easy answer there. But on top of all of that, all the headlines, controversy, and policy, one question remains. Has the experiment in hardline immigration laws been a success? Well, like all things, it's complicated. The answer depends on what criteria you judge the laws. Asylum claim applications are certainly down in Denmark, in stark contrast to much of the rest of Europe. The number, as of May 2025, is the lowest in 40 years, according to immigration.dk. If you're looking for pure results in terms of numbers, Denmark's policies are an unequivocal success. If you're looking at other issues, possibly not. If you separate the arguments around compassion and vulnerability amongst refugees for a moment, problems still emerge for Denmark. It, like much of Europe, has a rapidly aging population and not enough young people to replace them. The Danish fertility rate is around 1.5 births per woman as of 2023. A standard replacement level fertility rate is a minimum of 2.1. Sure, immigration policies may shore up security and the high standard of living in Denmark for the time being. But what about the long term? they could easily face a labour shortage. Less labour, fewer total taxes. Fewer taxes put the public purse under pressure from a different angle as the population ages and needs things like healthcare disproportionately. And if they do one day need to attract more migration to bulk up those tax figures, they may find it difficult to attract people towards a country which has become so hostile to foreign-born people. However, that's Denmark's problem tomorrow. Its problem today is mass migration. The Danish PM, commenting on this balance, said, quote, "I totally believe in equal opportunities and a Scandinavian welfare model with a tax-paid education, social benefits, and healthcare. But for me, that's only one traditional pillar of being a social democrat. Being in control of migration is the second pillar." In reality, these kind of policies change for every nation based on their specific set of circumstances and geographic location. Denmark, with its EU law carve-outs and Nordic location, has allowed it to see the realities of both Sweden and Germany firsthand while keeping the issue at arm's length. Italy, being where many migrants cross from Africa too, has a different priority of ensuring offshore asylum processing, and Eastern Hungary's priority is on protecting the nation's Christian roots. Meanwhile, Spain, with a rapidly aging population and towns becoming abandoned, has gone the other way, bringing in more immigrants generally to the tune of levels 4 times higher than somewhere like Italy. But as we see more mass migration into Europe, the Danish have been revealed as ahead of the curve. The majority of their policies were passed in the late 2010s, but many started as early as 2015 and before. The Danish position is the tip of the spear. What everyone back then called outrageous is now a pretty mainstream view across Europe. And so we continue to see the rise in policies like this towards the issue of immigration in Europe. Germany, Sweden, the UK, France, and Italy all have significant numbers of citizens who want to see their governments act tougher on immigration. The traditional lines of the Overton window are blurring all over Europe. People like British Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, stated that mass migration could lead to the UK becoming, quote, "a country of strangers." The British government has also boasted about their record number of deportations in comparison to the previous government, and have even taken on parts of the Danish approach by advertising in other countries for their citizens to stay away from the UK. The point is, this kind of policy move is a growing trend not exclusive to Denmark. Copenhagen simply acts as a window into what happens if a zero-refugee policy is championed and relentlessly pursued. As Europe continues to take on mass migration and the issues that arise from it, there is a reason to believe that we are witnessing the birth of a new European attitude towards immigration that appears like it's here to stay. It's one that is generally more restrictive and hostile to outsiders. It's one that is more skeptical of asylum seekers. And it's one that could upend the status quo on global refugee rights. Thank you for watching.